Welcome to the Nanovation Podcast. Information about this and other episodes can be found at fillerlab.com/nanovation. If you like what you hear, be sure to tell a friend or leave a review at Apple Podcasts. It really does help. I welcome your thoughts and suggestions. You can contact me on Twitter at Michael Filler or via email at nanovationpodcast@gmail.com. Thank you to the Chi Foundation for their generous financial support.
You've just stepped on my soapbox. I mean, that's exactly why the people who work on organics should be working on organics for. I mean, I think, there's a lot of people trying to make broad spectrum absorption organic solar cell. But I mean, at the end of the day, you're not going to compete with silicon.
That's Lynn Loo from Princeton University. She directs the Andlinger Center for Energy and the Environment. We have a wide-ranging discussion about organic semiconductors, the far more tunable and flexible siblings of hard materials, such as gallium arsenide or silicon. Lynn explains how these materials are being used in technology spaces where hard materials just can't go, and how nanostructuring offers additional control over their properties. We also touch on the need and value of industry-academic partnerships, and on her experience as a minority in science and engineering. I really enjoyed this discussion, and I think you will too. This is the Nanovation Podcast, an exploration of big innovations emerging from small things. I'm Mike Filler, your host and a professor at the Georgia Institute of Technology. Enjoy the show. I'm talking with Lynn Loo, who is the Walton Professor in Engineering, and she's a professor of chemical and biological engineering at Princeton University. And she also directs the Andlinger Center for Energy and the Environment. So we'll come back and talk about that in a minute. But just to give you a sense for how accomplished Lynn is, she's won pretty much every award in the kind of material space for chemical engineers to win. From AICHE, the Owens Corning Award, the Alan P. Colburn Award, from the National Science Foundation, a Career Award, and these are just a few. So I'm really excited to have you on the podcast today, Lynn, and thank you for taking some time.
Oh, thanks, Mike. Well, that was quite an introduction, so I hope I don't disappoint.
If people are still listening, they know that it's got to be better than me. So we're doing fine. So let's go back and talk about the Andlinger Center. Can you describe what it is and what your goals are?
Sure. So the Andlinger Center for Energy and the Environment, it's a relatively new interdisciplinary center. It's based in the School of Engineering and Applied Science at Princeton University. And our mission is actually very simple. It's to develop solutions to better our energy and environmental future. It's a broad goal. It's a very ambitious goal. It's grounded in technology. And that's who we are. We're about 110 faculty members strong, working on all sorts of solutions, from technology solutions to policy solutions that can better the energy and environmental future.
And so one of the things I find interesting about these kinds of centers, and I would argue many of the top research institutions in the country and probably around the world have a center that says they're going to do something relatively similar in energy and the environment. And I know you know this, and so I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about what you try to do at the Andlinger Center that you feel is different and hopefully more effective than what others have tried or are doing.
Well, I mean, I think there are multiple answers to that. I mean, the Andlinger Center, we try to leverage Princeton's strength, right? Being at Princeton, and so Princeton's, compared to our peer institutions, Princeton's a relatively small place. We don't have any professional schools, but what we have strength is in the liberal arts. So we try to leverage that. We have a school of architecture and we have a policy school, and so we try to really leverage what we have here. Princeton Princeton's a place that's known for interdisciplinary research. And so, again, these types of interdisciplinary centers become, it's really in our blood. It's in our DNA, right? And if, I don't know whether you know this, but Princeton has an informal motto, and the informal motto is "in the nation's service and in the service of humanity." And so, to me, the Andlinger Center is really Princeton's response to the energy and environmental challenges today in the service of humanity. And so we do this in collaboration with folks in School of Architecture, folks in the policy school, the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Policy, with our sister organization, Princeton Environmental Institute. They study the science of climate and environmental change, and we try to take cues from them to develop the solutions that are necessary to curb global warming or climate change.
So one of the things that the Andlinger Center has on the website, and this goes back to your comment earlier about that it's technology-driven, is collaborations between academia and industry.
That's right.
And from my experience, those are, in many cases, hard to establish in the sense that academics are often looking for something different than someone in industry is looking for. And in fact, I think it's in many ways gotten worse over the years in terms of finding common ground that can benefit both groups of people. And so I was curious if you could talk to how you think about jumpstarting or facilitating these kinds of industry academic collaborations, and what you've found challenging and perhaps what has surprised you as you've tried to help set these up.
Well, I think that's certainly true, especially for a place like Princeton. I think one of the things that sets us apart is we've been known for studying very, very fundamental topics, right? And so to bridge that gap and to think about technology, I think you need that added dimension. And I think interacting with practitioners, that's why industry is so important, because they are practitioners, brings that different dimension, right? It brings an added dimensionality to the kinds of problems that you want to solve. It brings that added urgency to the kinds of problems you want to solve. And so I view interactions with industry, especially at the Andlinger Center, to be critical because of this. It completes the teacher, student, practitioner triangle, because our students are exposed to us and only us otherwise. But when they're exposed to practitioners, they're exposed to a completely different set of problems and challenges. This goes for faculty members as well. You may think that you're solving the world's most interesting problem, and you talk to a practitioner and they tell you, well, there's this other problem that is urgent and we need to solve it. And maybe they could tap your expertise in helping them solve these problems. And so I think it really speaks to the true meaning of engineering and to innovation and to technology. And so I view that interaction as being really, really important.
I completely agree with what you're saying. I think I actually lament what I see as, broadly speaking, not specifically at Princeton, but just generally speaking, less interaction than what has happened in the past. And I'm if I think about my own community, and you're sort of part of that, in the electronics space, there used to be a time where industry would come, academia would come, and a lot of what academics did in that space was driven by problems industry had. And many times they weren't specific things, but they were kind of general classes of problems. And industry was happy to come to the table and say, we're really struggling with this, and we could use some support from you all. And that helped direct the efforts of academics. And I fear that in recent years, there hasn't been as much of that sharing, so to speak. And that leaves academics free to do more esoteric things, which has positives because you find new things. But then there's this hole where we're not necessarily contributing as much as we could to the real technological challenges that people are facing.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, these kinds of partnerships certainly is not for everybody. So I'm not advocating that everybody should do this.
Yeah.
And I think part of the challenge, I would say they're twofold, right? I mean, I think given the successes at Princeton, it's the success of Alimta, the drug that was discovered here. But given these kinds of successes, there's this idea of, I need to protect my IP. So that immediately builds that barrier to communicating freely between industry and ourselves, right? And so that barrier really needs to come down if you want to have any meaningful partnership and meaningful conversation. The other is the incommensurability in timeline, right? In the expectations. I think where partnerships thrive is where, you have an understanding of the time it takes to get the project done and the solution that you're looking for. I think where the partnership is effective is when industry know that it's not going to be in 3 months that I can give you an answer, right? Because, I mean, after all, as academics, our primary responsibility is to educate the next generation. And a PhD takes 5 years because you need to bring the student up to speed. And so a large part of that is the learning process. And so you can't expect an answer in 3 months and hope that a student can get you there in 3 months. And so I think defining the right problems is critical in this. And that is what makes the partnership successful.
I was going to say, going back to the IP thing for a second, I believe what you were saying was correct me if I'm wrong, was that it was the university saying, and just university in a general sense saying, we want to protect our IP generated here, so we're not as open to collaboration? Or do you see it come from both sides?
I think it's both sides, right? I mean, it's company X wanting everything, and then the university not willing to give anything.
Right.
And so there needs to be a middle ground where you can meet. Otherwise, this is not going to happen. And so I think at Princeton, what we've been partly successful at doing is, we have a very progressive Office of Licensing Technology, and they understand the urgency and they understand the need for building these kinds of partnership. And so they're willing to work with the faculty, and they're willing to listen to the company needs, and by being nimble and by being flexible in the terms, we're able to generate these partnerships through big umbrella agreements. And by doing a big umbrella agreement, then, so for example, we have this umbrella agreement with ExxonMobil. And so what that means is anybody at ExxonMobil or any business unit at ExxonMobil can collaborate with any faculty member at Princeton University without having to undergo a separate negotiation process. The terms don't have to be separately negotiated. Everything's been negotiated up front, and they come through this umbrella agreement. So then PIs or researchers can focus their discussion or their negotiation on the science, defining the scope of the project, as opposed to, the legal terms of things, because all that's been pre-negotiated.
I always find it interesting how much universities these days seem to want to protect the IP, because your second point was that our number one mission is to train the next generation, right? And if we want to protect our IP all the time, then we're not getting the projects funded to support that training, right? And I think if you talk to a lot of academics, a lot of professors who run research labs, they would say, I don't really care about that part so much. I would love to work on an interesting problem and support students in their training.
Right. And if you talk to, I'm not actually sure I should be saying this, but I mean, if you talk to, folks who are doing the licensing, so for example, the director of Office of Licensing Technology here will tell you that frequently with sponsored research, there's very little IP that's generated from that process, because the sponsored research nature of the project is so directed already that there's no, there's no accidental or serendipitous discovery of additional new IP.
Yeah. I was going to say that this was at MIT. I was visiting, and I'm trying to remember the exact numbers. It was something like IP, even there, provided 1% of the operating budget, or revenue from IP provided 1% of the operating budget.
Well, I think everybody's erring on the side of caution in the event that there's, another Olympta, for example, right? I mean, Olympta's been, really, really good for campus and for Princeton University, especially for chemistry, right? And it built them the new building. There have been separate endowments for graduate student fellowships, resources for the department, et cetera, et cetera. And so, I mean, I think one needs to weigh the probability, I suppose.
Right.
Yeah.
And it goes back to the serendipitous part. Like, can you actually predict that? And
Right.
Can you explain what that drug is? Because I'm not familiar with it.
I think it's a cancer-treating drug.
I see.
Yeah, that Ed Taylor discovered while he was here on the
Interesting.
faculty.
I'll put a link in the show notes, so I'll dig up some stuff on that. How long have you been in this director's role at the Andlinger Center?
Not very long. So I've been the director for 6 months, since July 2016. That said, I've been with the center since almost the beginning. So just to give you some background, the center was founded based on a very generous donation from an alum. His name is Gary Andlinger. So that gift came in 2008. The founding director was identified in 2010, so the center is really about 6 years old. And during that 6-year duration, I was here as the associate director for external partnerships with Emily Carter, who was then the director. And so in that capacity, I founded and led Princeton E-Affiliates Partnership. So that's our corporate affiliates program. And so it's through that corporate affiliates program that ExxonMobil came in, along with several other companies.
So let's talk about science for a little bit. Most of the folks I've had on the podcast, when they've been working on nanomaterials, have been working on hard nanomaterials, crystalline nanomaterials. And your research is in softer materials, and specifically in organic semiconductors. So can you talk about what those are and how people are thinking about applying them?
Sure. So organic here refers to carbon-containing materials, right? So these are molecules. These are molecular materials as opposed to these hard crystals that you referred to earlier on. And because they're molecular materials, these intermolecular interactions are important. These intermolecular interactions are van der Waals interactions. And so the way they're held together is weak, and therefore you refer to them as soft materials. These soft materials, the charge transport mechanism in these are quite different from hard materials. Charge transport happens by a hopping mechanism. And so it's important that these organic semiconductors, one characteristic trait in these materials is that they have a lot of carbon-carbon double bonds. With carbon-carbon double bonds, you have pi orbitals. And when these pi orbitals overlap between neighboring molecules, it enables charges to hop from one molecule to another molecule. So intrinsic in this process, what it means is that the conductivity or the mobility, if you will, is not very high, right? Because it happens through a hopping mechanism as opposed to band transport. And what it also means is that structuring of these materials becomes important. You alluded to crystalline materials. We want these materials to be crystalline as well, because what that means is you have long range order, and so you can propagate charge, or your charges can hop along the direction with which pi stack happens. So crystallinity is important in these materials as well.
So you've kind of talked about the challenges of making them, let's just call them higher performance in terms of controlling the hopping of charge. Before we get to that, why are people interested in them at all relative to crystalline materials?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the idea is that you bring in the unique attributes of organic systems, right? I mean, so the attributes that you usually think of when you think of molecular systems, you can bring those in to the semiconducting world. So what are those attributes? One is tunability, right? So at the onset of synthesis, if you can add substituents, if you can modify the conjugated core, you can affect the molecule's solubility, thermal properties, mechanical properties, electronic properties, optical properties. And that's something that brings richness to the kind of properties that can be accessible with the materials. So at the beginning, it's sort of designer materials. So you can dial in the properties you want at the onset of synthesis.
That's really important. Let me jump in real quick, because when you have silicon, for example, you have the diamond cubic structure, which is the thermodynamically most stable structure, and there's lots of other structures of silicon, but they're achieved at pressures and temperatures that are extreme and not really fun or easy to deal with. So silicon can be made to behave differently too. It's just so hard to get it to do something different. Whereas these organic materials, like you're saying, organic chemists over the years over centuries, right, have developed a toolkit to pretty much make not everything you could ever want, but most of what you could want. And you have that extreme tunability you're talking about, which is very different from these crystalline materials, which have a much narrower range. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think part of the, a big part of the community is trying to address, they're trying to come up with design rules, right? And so I think we know generally what happens when you add, X to Y, but coming up with specific design rules to predict a priori the properties that one should get if one made molecule X as opposed to molecule Y becomes a big field in what we're doing.
Yeah. Okay, so tunability, and then I guess another area is in kind of processability and mechanical properties.
Mechanical properties, right? These are organics, or they can frequently be plastics or polymers. So they are flexible, they can be bendable, and that certainly is not true with silicon. If you take a piece of silicon wafer and you try to bend it, it fractures, and that doesn't happen with organics. Lightweight, right? So these are organics, and they're plastics. So compared to silicon, they're certainly lighter weight. So for things where, weight is a concern, for things where mechanical integrity is a concern, you can think about sacrificing a little bit of your optoelectronic properties in lieu of the improved mechanical properties or the lightweightness of these materials.
So one application that we can talk about specifically, by the way, I chuckled a little bit when you sent me this link with your students on the radio show, because we were going to talk about it on the podcast, but you had some students, and I'll put a link to their recording on, I guess it was a Princeton radio show.
That's right.
Talking about their work with you. You're their advisor, and they're working, I'll just call them on materials for smart windows. And can you talk about that a little bit, how these organic semiconductors are used in that application and what that application is?
Yeah, so there's two components to that story, right? So there is the smart window itself. So that's an electrochromic film. And electrochromic just means you have to apply power, right, or a potential, and then it changes the color of the film. So it's an electrochromic film, and what we were doing, or what the pair of students were doing, is to pair that electrochromic film with a solar cell. So the idea is for the solar cell to absorb sunlight and generate power, and use that power to power the tunability or the switching of that electrochromic film. So it's a self-powered solar curtain, if you will. And the reason we do that is, so these solar cells that we make, they absorb ultraviolet light. And you might ask, well, why do you want to just absorb ultraviolet light? I think this brings in the one of the uniqueness of organic compounds, a little bit like your nanocrystals. You can tune their absorption profile by tuning the chemistry. And so we can tune our molecules so they only absorb in the UV. And the reason we only want to absorb in the UV is because we want to leave the visible light and the near infrared light for the regulation, so that it can get into the buildings, right, for lighting and heating purposes. So you're not competing for the same range of the solar spectrum, if you will. Does that make sense?
Sure, right.
Okay.
You can't, that light is not that useful and contributes to heating your home, which I guess in sometimes parts of the year is not what you want.
That's right. And so, or, during in the cold winter, you want that infrared light. And so we don't want to absorb it in our solar cell because you want that to come into the building. And so we're not competing for that infrared light.
Right. So the solar cell piece of this, it's a great idea because you're also, when you think about manufacturing and installing a window like this, I have this picture of contractors putting in a window and then having to plug the window into the outlet or something like that.
Right.
And that is not a way to install a window, right? So this is ultimately a self-contained kind of
That's right.
thing. And so on the smart window part, I'm hoping you can educate me a little bit, because it'd be really great for control of energy flow in a house or a building. And there's lots of different energies to consider, right? There's the light coming in of different wavelengths, and the light going out, right? The infrared light that is coming off of things inside a home or a building that may need to get out, or maybe you don't want it to go out. So I feel like one of the things I've never really understood about this application is, how do you control both directions of energy transport?
So we don't. I mean, so here the main consideration is the sunlight coming in. And so we're making basically a building energy efficiency argument. We're making an occupant comfort argument. We're saying that if you can regulate and make use of visible an infrared light that's coming into the building, you can perhaps shave off a little bit of the energy needs of the building, because currently, buildings use up 40% of the energy that's generated, right? So it's a big piece of the energy demand. And so if we can even shave off a little bit of that, that could make an impact on carbon emissions, that can make an impact on sort of the energy demand on the system. So that's the idea.
And ultimately, though, I guess maybe it's technologically beyond where we are. It would be great to control flow in both directions of different portions of the electromagnetic spectrum, but we're just kind of not there yet from a materials perspective.
Yeah, and I mean, I think one needs to consider how much there is also. And my sense is, again, I've not done the calculation. I've actually not thought about it, but my sense is, at least intuitively, my sense is there's substantially more coming in than going out. Because, I mean, what's generating light that's going out? It would be, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think each photon is clearly of higher energy coming in.
Yes.
I guess the question is, how many photons at lower energy are trying to get out? And I don't know the answer to that. And so maybe someone out there who's listening can let us know. And, of course, we could do the research as well. But that's the thing I don't know. And you may be very well right that the number of low-energy photons that are being emitted by things inside a building, that's small potatoes compared to the amount of high-energy photons that are coming in. Right.
That's at least my sense. And I think you want it to come in on a cold winter day so you don't have to spend as much energy heating your room. Right. So that's the idea. And then on a hot day, you want to filter that infrared from coming into the building. So you don't, again, spend all that energy in cooling that room.
Right. No, I love the engineering aspects of that project, and the fundamental materials questions are really, really interesting.
I mean, I'm super, super proud of this pair of students because, I mean, when they first started the project, these were two independent projects, and both of them started with synthesis. So, I mean, for the solar cell project, Nick Davey, the student, actually started out learning how to do synthesis. And the synthesis was something I had learned when I was on sabbatical, and I brought back to Princeton, and he learned how to do the synthesis for totally different applications. But it was he started with synthesis, materials characterization, making the solar cell, and then it was through them talking to each other because they sit in the same office that they said, we could potentially pair our two devices together to do this. So it was great to see how it came together.
And it's also a great use of organic materials because, as you know very well, if you tried to make a solar cell for collecting as much energy from the sun as possible, like we do primarily with silicon solar cells today, that is difficult, right? The efficiencies are not what silicon or other materials can hit. And so you kind of picked this really beautiful niche where it's processable, it can be in a single package, and you get this, you combine it with the electrochromic piece, which the crystalline materials don't do nearly as well. And it's a really nice thing that's well suited for the organic material.
You've just stepped on my soapbox. I mean, that's exactly why the people who work on organics should be working on organics for. I mean, I think, you know, there's a lot of people trying to make broad spectrum absorption organic solar cell. But I mean, at the end of the day, you're not going to compete with silicon. Silicon's been optimized to do what they do, right? I mean, we're pretty close to the theoretical maximum efficiency that you can achieve with silicon. And so in my sense, that's not where we should go with organics. I think organics, we should leverage the unique attributes that are associated with organics and really build on that. And there are niche markets. They are good for certain things. They're just not good for what silicon is good for, right?
Right.
And we should leverage that.
Yeah, no, how do you differentiate yourself?
That's right.
Thinking carefully about that. So this is a podcast about nanoscience, nanotechnology. And so what we've talked about thus far with organic semiconductors occurs in thin films of these materials. So it may be as nanoscale thick, but there isn't additional degrees of confinement. And I was just curious if you could kind of talk about where nanoscale structural control is useful for these materials.
Oh, I think structuring is gravely important in these materials because they are polycrystalline films, right? I mean, yes, the in the vertical direction, they may be 20 to 100 nanometers thick. So in that sense, they're nano scale. But in the in-plane dimension, the grain size is very, very important. If you have grain boundaries, they can trap charge. So being able to control that becomes important. Controlling the in-plane orientation is important because charge transport in these materials is anisotropic. So they are fastest in the direction of pi stacking. So you want to pi stack in the direction of your electrodes where you want charges to flow. And so being able to coax the molecules so they crystallize in that fashion as opposed to any other fashion becomes very important. And all that happens at the nanometer length scale. So we don't control nanometer length scale through synthesis like you do, but we control nanometer length scale structuring through processing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, for sure. And it's not necessarily an individual entity, but
that's right.
In a film,
collections of them.
Exactly, collections, and the interface between them is absolutely critical. These grain boundaries you're talking about.
Yeah.
No, so it's what some people say. Well, so you make nanoparticles, so what? But really, nanoscience is controlling any matter at the nanometer length scale, and then so that's a great example of something where it's not a separate entity, so to speak, but just our ability to control matter and manipulate matter gives you new things you can do and gives you new capabilities. That's
right, and I mean that's why I'm inspired by your work too, Michael, because I think you can draw a lot of analogies. I mean there are these hierarchical structuring that becomes important in molecular systems that you see in nanocrystals too, because if you boil it down at the end of the day, you're putting assemblies of atoms together to form nanocrystals, and then you have to put assemblies of nanocrystals together to form, a film or whatever that then goes into a device, right? And so there's this hierarchical structuring that one needs to pay attention to really get out the macroscopic properties that you're looking for. And that's the same with molecular systems as well.
That's a great point. And I would argue that that's one of the most challenging things, is not just making the nanoscale thing, but interfacing it and having this hierarchical interfacing to give you at the macroscopic level the properties you want. It's a great point. So I'm kind of curious, if you think about organic semiconductors, which it was the late 70s when they were first kind of discovered or demonstrated that you could create semiconducting, or I guess metallic conduction in an organic polymer material?
Yeah, I think it was 60s probably.
Okay.
I mean, Alan Heeger, Shigeki Hirakawa, and Alan McDermott, they won the Nobel Prize in chemistry. I think it's 2000, but this discovery happened probably in the 60s, I want to say. It's by iodine doping of polyacetylene, right? And so they saw that by doping it with iodine, you can make polyacetylene, which is nominally an insulator, be metallic-like, and it can conduct. And so they were awarded the Nobel Prize in 2000 for that discovery.
And so if we think about because at the time, right, this was bonkers. This was crazy that something like a polymer, like plastic, which we're used to thinking about very differently, could conduct, and you could control that conduction. And so people started to generate all these ideas for what you would do with it. You make electronic circuits, and pretty much anything a semiconductor can do, like silicon. Can we think about it for organics? And I'm curious if you could talk about what of that original vision has worked and what still really remains challenging and elusive.
Yeah, I mean, I would say the one success story would be LEDs, right? Organic LEDs, and there, you see them in all sorts of consumer products. You see them in the small displays in your razor, to phones, right? The cell phones, to even TV screens. So there, I think the proposition is very clear. They have certain unique attributes compared to liquid crystalline displays, etc. They're very brilliant. Their viewing angle is very, very large. So those are the kinds of things that, liquid crystals and other technologies don't compete well with. And so they've made it to the market and they've done well.
So that's an important point, right? So that's performance. They're beating the conventional things on performance.
I think that's a number one. If you can't beat the conventional thing, there's no sense in talking about it. I feel like, you need to articulate why they're better, or how they open up, or how they meet an unmet need or an unchallenged problem. I think those are important aspects of innovation that people don't usually talk about. They focus on the technology development. But I think it's important to be able to articulate what the market is and how you're meeting certain needs and demands.
I agree. So what's elusive? So that's a huge success story, but what remains tough?
Well, I think, the community has tried, and with some success, made transistors with these materials. And the transistors now have, mobilities of order 1 to 10, so centimeters squared per volt second. So it's not shabby, but you're not going to be able to use it to make the next generation computer chips, right? It's just not fast enough. Yeah. And so I think it's articulating what kinds of applications these transistors would be good for. Same with solar cells. What is the record efficiency of solar cells today? For polymer solar cells is probably about 12 to 13%. They're nowhere close to silicon. They're nowhere as stable as silicon. And so if you're going to compete head on with silicon, I think that's a very, very difficult proposition. But instead, if you think about tuning their absorption profile, so you create solar cells that are tinted because they absorb different wavelengths of light, or solar cells that are transparent because you can integrate them into buildings and into windows, then it's a completely different story, right? Because you're not competing with silicon anymore, because you're doing things that silicon cannot do.
Exactly.
So that's where we are, I would say. We're trying to still, we as in the community, still trying to figure out that space, right?
Yeah, no, and so related to that, I was curious if you could comment on what I'll say the rise of perovskite materials and nanocrystals, because for a long time, it was, if you wanted something processable and flexible and all those things, organic semiconductors were the thing. And then over the last 10 or 15 years, there's been this increasing work in small particles that are crystalline but can be processed in similar ways, and the same thing with the perovskites. And so how has the community had to adopt or kind of modify how they approach their challenges in light of these other areas?
Well, I would say that, folks who are working on organic photovoltaics, a lot of them have now expanded their research portfolio to look at perovskites, simply because, the argument is, these are solution processable just like organic semiconductors. So if we know organic semiconductors and we know how to process them, we should be able to make perovskite cells. And that's partly true, I suppose. But I think perovskites, yes, it has this impressive rise in efficiency. What was it in the short span of from 2009 until now? The efficiency, if you look at the NRAL percentile chart, the efficiency rise is the steepest of any technology. It's 22% now in terms of efficiency. So it's really, really impressive. And one's tempted to just look at that and say, this is our solution to everything, right? But let's not forget the couple of challenges associated with perovskites. The cells aren't very stable. Right?
Yeah.
And they're very hysteretic in their performance, meaning that when you sweep it forwards versus when you sweep it backwards, the JV characteristics look completely different. Now, this may not bother somebody who's coming from a dye-sensitized solar cell background because dye-sensitized cells have this hysteretic behavior,
right.
but it should certainly bother people who are making solid-state cells because right?
Silicon
that's
does
a
not
big
have
problem.
that problem.
Yeah, that's a big problem.
Exactly.
And then the cells that perform right now have lead in them.
Yeah.
And that reaction, if you know that reaction, right? I mean, that reaction is not a one-way reaction. It's a reversible reaction. When it sees water, it goes the other way. So I think there's still a whole suite of problems and challenges, I'll call them, that the community needs to solve before I think we're going to see one of these on our roofs.
Although I tell you, the thing I find funny is different technologies' use of toxic materials. People feel very differently, right? You can coal, people or fossil fuels, which have these kinds of impurities in them. We burn them. We put these impurities in the atmosphere. You breathe them in. That's fine. I'm used to that. Cadmium, telluride solar cells full of cadmium. We're going to put solar cells all over our roof. We're fine with that. All of a sudden, I think people will be fine with the lead too, actually.
Well, I think the lead is that's not in itself the problem, but it's the ease with which you form lead that's the problem, right?
Yes, agreed.
And
yeah.
I mean the way these are processed, you start out with lead iodide, methyl ammonium iodide, whatever. You dissolve them in a solvent that your gloves don't protect you, and so the gloves can actually, the solvent can penetrate the gloves and so can carry these lead precursors through the skin, right? There are all sorts of, it's not lead in itself that's the problem, right? I mean, if you have a big chunk of lead, that doesn't do any harm. That in itself is not the problem. It's just the ease with which these things move around, the mobility, for the lack of a better word, the migration of these atoms and ions, that's what causes concern, in my opinion.
Completely agree. And the chemistry is really important, right? So I was kind of joking a little bit about the cadmium telluride. This cadmium bonded to tellurium in that crystal is very different than a cadmium molecule. And there's been,
that's right.
Over the years, lots of, what is it? What was the movie with Julia Roberts? That story about, wasn't that cadmium, like hexamethyl cadmium or something?
Oh, yeah. Was it Aaron Brockovich? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That's a very specific molecule, right? And it really matters what the chemical structure is. And so in the case of these perovskite solar cells, the chemical structure is not your best friend. That version of lead...
The stability of the chemical structure is not your best friend. That's right.
Yeah, and it's easily transportable, and that combination is not what you want.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
Yeah. So... let's finish up, and actually I want to go back to something I read in the story about you and some of your colleagues going to Davos. Well, so the story about you attending the World Economic Forum in Davos had a section in it where it talked about you being on a breakfast influencer panel, and on that panel, you talked about energy technology, which we've kind of already talked about. And then it said, and you also spoke about women in technology. And as chair of the Faculty Search Committee in Chemical Engineering here at Georgia Tech, implicit bias is something we think about a lot. And I'm actually blown away at some of the studies that have been done on this, where two identical resumes with different names, whether it's someone of Caucasian descent and, so let's say a male and a woman, same resume, different names, the number of times they're called back is wildly different. The male is called back at a much higher rate than the female, even though the resume is identical. And the same kinds of studies have been done for various minorities, et cetera, right? And this blows my mind. And so... I was hoping you could talk for a few minutes as someone who's been very successful in science and engineering, brilliant publications, award winner, all of those things, about your experience, the challenges, and advice you might share for people who are just getting started. Because many of the listeners of this podcast are graduate students, are undergrads thinking about graduate school, and I think they'd love to hear about your experience and advice you might have.
When you brought the conversation back to Davos, the immediate thing that I thought about was how at Davos you would never notice this if you were there, because you see a lot of women walking around going to these different sessions. But really, if you look at the official count, the percentage of delegates that are women, can you guess what that number is?
I'll go 10.
So it's a little better than that, but it's 15%, right?
Okay.
I mean, and let's not forget, this is primarily a business meeting, right? And so 15% is pretty low, right? I mean, it's not as low as perhaps you would expect to see in science and engineering. Maybe that's why you said 10%, but 15% is still pretty low.
Agreed.
You'd never expect this, and you would never guess this number if you were walking around at the World Economic Forum. Because a lot of the attendees could be spouses and could be, assistants and things like that are there, or support staff and things like that that are there. So I find that still kind of surprising and appalling. And I think you're right. There's this implicit bias that really is ingrained in a lot of us. And I have a 3-year-old child at home, and so I go home always thinking, I hope I'm not accidentally or, unintentionally teaching my child some of these implicit biases, right? I mean, you won't know because it's implicit and it's sometimes unintended, right? Yes, and it starts young. So I have a friend and a colleague here who's in the philosophy department. Sarah Jane Leslie has written a lot about this. And she claims from her studies that this sets in at age 5. So anyway, coming back to your question about sort of when I was an assistant professor, I've heard lots of horror stories. I've been very fortunate. I've not seen a lot of these. Maybe part of it is my personality too. I was brought up in a very tough family. so I'm not one fazed by things that people say. And so maybe it's that, but I've not had any issues, quote unquote, growing up in academia. That said, now that I'm in the role of a director and I'm leading searches and things like that, I do see some of that now, right? In trying to encourage other department chairs or other center directors to consider candidates. I do see some of that. And I think a lot about how we can overcome this because, I think we really need to, because otherwise we're only as good as our weakest link, right? I think these implicit biases are very, very harmful because, you only need one person with a very strong opinion about it, and that can influence how everybody else's think.
Have you had role models that you've looked up to over the years?
Yeah, yes. And when you ask me this, I think of 3 people in particular. One's my dad. I think, he instilled in me hard work and a strong sense of right from wrong. And always, no matter how vulnerable you are, you always should be seeking for the truth. That's really had a great influence on me. And I'm particularly close with him, especially after my mom died when we were young. So he's a role model. He's somebody that I look up to a lot. And then of course, there are a couple of other people that come to mind. My thesis advisors, one, Rick Register, he approaches life and approaches whether it's scientific problems or any kind of problem with so much gusto and passion that it's incredible and it's very infectious. And and I've always told myself that, if something's worth doing, I should do it 100%, 110%. Otherwise, it's not worth doing and you shouldn't be doing it. So that's guided me in what I do too.
Yeah, I think a lot of academics would say that's one of the things that led them to the academy is they're the kinds of people that get passionate about something and don't really want to work on something they're not passionate about. So that's the nice thing about being a faculty member, is if you can get money for it, then you can do it. And so that's the nice feature.
Yeah, but I mean, in this day and age, it's maybe this is the skeptic in me now. It's also very easy to kind of say, oh, that's where the money is, and therefore I'm going to do that. And so knowing what's the chicken and what's the egg and which comes first becomes very important. And so I don't know about others. I do a lot of soul searching very late at night or early in the mornings, like 3 o'clock in the morning, on sort of, is this worth doing, and why am I doing this? Because I think, we as academics, we have the luxury to be able to think about these kinds of things. So,
You bring up a good point there, too. That this funding is usually available for certain areas that people already think are important, right? So if you're passionate about something that's not clearly important yet, let's say, right? There's not as much money available because people as a collective don't recognize that that's the next big thing.
Sure.
You hope it will be. You don't know, but there's not as much money. So how do you make that decision, right? Do you go for something in an area where there is money? Or are you still trying to push on something you're really passionate about, knowing full well that it may take years before other people recognize the value in it, right?
So, I think there are multiple aspects to that. I think, you don't put all your eggs in one basket. So, if it's risky and you think, the returns are high, then you should certainly persist. But certainly that shouldn't be the only thing you do, right? I would say, especially for people going up for tenure, that's true. So you should hedge your bets, basically. You may put 1 or 2 students on it, but you wouldn't put your whole group of students on that problem.
Yeah.
And then B is, if you really believe in it, you should persist in it, because chances are you have instincts that are right. But then I would say it's also knowing when to punt, right? So, okay, you believe in it, and you should be introspective enough to check once in a while to make sure you still believe in it. And if you don't, because you've gained certain amount of information that you didn't have before, you need to punt, and you need to be able to be sufficiently humble that you're willing to do that, right? Because it's an ego call too.
Well, Lynn Loo from Princeton, thank you so much for taking a few minutes. It's been really fun.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity. I enjoyed talking to you, Michael.
You've been listening to Nanovation. If you enjoyed the show, please leave a rating or write a review on Apple Podcasts. Show notes are available at fillerlab.com/nanovation. Nanovation is recorded in the Marcus Nanotechnology Building on the campus of Georgia Tech. Andrew Cannon edits the show. I'm Mike Filler. See you next time.